go ahead and get started. A couple announcements as we get started. Students that are students in the class, after class we will do our evaluations. So these are slightly informal. It's not the regular idea score evaluations, but we do collect your comments for the department. So we'll treat it as we treat any other evaluation. I'll leave it for the students to pass out, collect, and deliver to the department after today's talk.
Hey Josh.
Yes.
I just want to clarify because I see a lot of my students in the class that he is talking about the grad students
Yes.
and not you guys. So don't say and fill those out, okay?
Yeah, students that are registered for this seminar class. The other announcement is that I made the mistake of assuming that we would have this room available to us next week, but since next week is the start of finals week, that is an incorrect assumption. So for next week's seminar, we will move to Animal Science 126. We've scheduled that room. So we have one talk next week, and we will move to Animal Science 126 for that, okay? With that, today we have one Master's Defense or Completion seminar for us. Kris Cudmore is joining us from a degree here in this department a couple of years ago. Currently works in Rapid City for GF&P, and he'll be talking about estimating population size of deer in the Black Hills and an evaluation of fall classification surveys of deer and pronghorn in South Dakota. With that, Kris, welcome.
All right, guys, thanks for coming here today. As he had mentioned, my name is Kris Cudmore. I'm from Rapid City, and I'll be talking to you about my study, which is titled Estimating Population Size of Deer in the Black Hills and an Evaluation of Fall Classification Surveys of Deer and Pronghorn, as he mentioned already. So that's quite a mouthful to say, so hopefully I've laid this out in a consumable format for you. We'll be talking about spotlight surveys for deer, fall class for both species of deer, mule deer and whitetail, and also pronghorn. So having said that, brief overview, the introduction, the objectives, the working hypothesis, study areas, methods, results, recommendations, and then at the very end, comments and questions. So an introduction for the Black Hills Deer Spotlight Survey, which was for whitetail deer only. The use of spotlight surveys has been evaluated before, several different places in the US and in Canada. In the Black Hills, very little has actually been done. There was one survey back in '64, Roguski and Dewar did like a 2-year study, I believe it was, and then South Dakota Game and Fish had done a survey, surveyed the population in the hills for about 10 years from the early 70s to the early 80s. However, that particular survey was nixed because there was a lack of staff to complete the survey. So kind of flipping over to fall classification of deer and pronghorn. Just one thing I wanted to mention, if I say fall classification or herd composition counts or age and sex ratios, I kind of use all those things interchangeably. So if I say one of those 3 words, that's what I'm getting at. So fall classification surveys are important for herd management practices. Currently, the quality of data was being questioned. So South Dakota Game and Fish currently requires 30 individual fawn observations for both species of deer and 10% of the pronghorn population for fall classification. So this 10% or this 10% projected doe population is derived from a spring aerial count that's generally done, I think it's every other year, late April to early May. So the objectives for this study for the Black Hills Deer Spotlight Survey, we wanted to estimate the population size of whitetail deer in the Black Hills using general randomized tessellation stratified sampling. From here on out, I'm going to say grits because that's way too much to say. It's a tongue twister. Program distance and spotlight, so we're coupling all 3 of those things. So in addition to a population size of the Black Hills, we wanted to also compare estimates of population size amongst management units. These management units were already determined by Game and Fish prior to the study, and they're actually the hunting units within the Black Hills. The objectives for the fall class deer and pronghorn, we wanted to determine a minimum sample size. We wanted to compare September and October for deer and August and September for pronghorn. Now, the reason these months were chosen was because this is a traditional survey month for Game and Fish, so we wanted to have basically keep it all the same to do what they're already currently doing. We also want to compare spotlight daylight counts for deer and also evaluate impacts of other survey variables. Some of these other variables were time that the counts took, topography, habitat variables, distance from cover, and whether or not the surveyor felt they had a complete count or not. So, working hypothesis for Black Hills deer, we had thought that some of the vegetative visual obstruction, trees, and some of the dense grass would lead to issues with deriving a population estimate. And we also had thought that getting a sex and age class ratio would be difficult to determine. You know, not only are you dealing with that dense vegetation, but also you're working at night under spotlight conditions. For fall classification of deer and pronghorn, we had thought that later survey periods would improve the observation rates. You know, basically as fall moves on, those animals start to congregate, start to get into herds for breeding behavior, and we had thought that seeing more of those animals in bigger groups would lead to better ratios because you could see them on the landscape a little bit easier. And also, as mentioned before, you know, we didn't think the current sample size goals are adequate to characterize the age or the sex ratios. So the study area, what you see there is a map of the Black Hills. It's just a GIS map. And if you notice those little red dots scattered throughout the map, those are our random tessellation points. So the Black Hills is about 8,400 kilometers squared, and it's about 30% meadows, 70% trees. And the elevation ranges from 900 meters to 1,200 meters. And that particular map, you look at it and you might actually think it's a watershed map or something of that nature. What that actually is a road map of the Black Hills. It has a really high road density, about 12,874 kilometers of roads. I've actually been told that this amount of roads is more than the city of Minneapolis has. It's anecdotal, but it's a lot of roads within a national forest. And actually, this is the highest, the most roaded national forest within the U.S. So a lot of roads out there, and that's one reason we had thought that we could do this distance sampling coupled with the random tessellation and spotlights is because of this amount of roads. And the dominant overstory is ponderosa pine. Flipping over to fall classification of deer, as you can see, that study area is pretty wide. I mean, it covers the whole state of South Dakota. There's 6 different study areas, 2 West River, one of which is the Black Hills. Then we have 2, I guess you'd call it mid-state, and then we've got 3 East River. Those units were chosen based upon area, and we needed to have people to run the survey, so they weren't super far out of the way. So there was I guess you would say it's a convenience factor. We needed people to run the survey. I obviously couldn't do all of that. Study areas for pronghorn, this was based upon density, and again, the density was defined by the spring aerial counts. So we had 2 high density study areas, 2 medium density study areas, and 2 low density study areas. Now, we wanted to make sure there was a buffer between all these study areas, so that way immigration wasn't leading to double sampling. Now that's going to bring your attention to this particular area right here. Now there isn't any land buffer there at all, but if you notice the squiggly lines around those particular counties, that's the Cheyenne River, so we had thought that this water barrier was going to be sufficient enough to keep much travel from happening by those animals. So methods, Black Hills study area, again, that grid sampling was used to determine placement of the routes. The data collected was deer observations and the group size, distance from the transect. Those 2 variables are super important for distance sampling. Habitat type, we basically just classified whether it was a tree or meadow habitat, and GPS locations at the start of the route, stop of the route, and with each deer observation. All right, methods continued. Start about a half hour after sunset and no more than 4 hours after the start period. We wanted to take advantage of deer activity. Some literature says out there that deer activity is going to kind of peak for about 4 hours or so and then start to dive after a few hours. So we want to take advantage of that. There was 2 spotlights and 2 observers per truck. We drove 2 routes per evening, and we wanted to make sure the wind was no more than 15 miles an hour and no precipitation. And we also counted and classified all deer, whitetail, mule deer, bucks, does, fawns, everything. Then when I was going to do the data analysis, I pulled out the mule deer and anything that we couldn't classify as a whitetail. Data was analyzed using distance sampling, program distance, and program R. For the methods of fall classification, the counts were done in the morning, evening, or under spotlight. 1 single observer was used for the morning and evening, and for spotlight counts, it is very similar to the Black Hills Deer Study. 2 observers, 2 trucks. If we made a sighting on a route, we didn't drive that route again, so generally I tried to keep the same observers in all the same study areas, so that way they could kind of keep track of that. Data was analyzed using ANOVA, and analysis were conducted by species within the region. Pronghorn. Counts were done anytime during daylight hours. All pronghorn were counted. It was only 1 single observer. Routes weren't traveled again if a sighting was made. And the data is analyzed using a 2-sample t-test, and they were done within study area. So the results. Sorry if I'm flying through this a little fast here. The results for the Black Hills Deer Spotlight Survey. So in 2012, we got around 49,000 deer. 2013, 37,000 deer, and in 2014, 52,000 deer. So you kind of see that dip in 2013, and I'll give you a graphic here in just a moment so you can kind of visualize it with a picture. But we had noticed that too. We said, well, what's going on? You know, being on the landscape, we're not seeing a bunch of deer die off. We didn't have a sudden jump in tags. What exactly is going on? What's attributing to this drop? So what we decided to do was really one of the only things we could do was we decided to add a few more transects. So we added 20 more transects for 2014 for a total of 62. Initially we had 42 transects. Now, what you see there, our theory was that would help detection rates and would also lower our confidence intervals just a little bit, which it did, and not by a whole lot. But so you might ask yourself, why only 20 extra transects? Why not 40 or 60 or even more? 20 was the maximum we could fit within the Black Hills, and we wouldn't have any type of interference with our other transects. In addition to that, staffing is always, kind of at the back of everyone's mind. Can we get it done? And 20 was able to be done. Anything more than that would have been kind of a hard thing to do. So the graphic I mentioned, so the bar graphs here, on the very far left is 2012, on the very far right is 2014 with the additional 20 routes. If you see those black lines there, those are our confidence intervals. They overlap pretty generously, which indicates that our population isn't wildly swinging around. We still don't have a clear answer as to what caused the drop in 2013, but more than likely it was due to detection rates of those deer. And still, this is a survey we're going to be implementing, so I need to still revise and work with this and try to figure out, how, if any way, to clean that up. So deer age and sex ratios, so whitetail age ratios. What I'm comparing here, just to kind of be clear, I'm comparing in this very first data analysis piece, daylight counts. So I'm comparing daylight counts from September to October and spotlight counts from September to October. For daylight, it was similar between months. For spotlight, it was different between months. And now this month comparison at the bottom, the daylight versus spotlight, I was comparing that within each month. So September daylight counts versus September spotlight counts. So daylight counts were higher in September and spotlight counts were higher in October. What we believe is going on there is, deer start to wean late September, fawns start to wean late September. Then October, they're up and running with mom. So they're not real active during the evening hours, so they're going to be bedded down in September, which is leading to more than likely what we're seeing there in September. In October, the bucks are coming in, fawns are running with mom. breeding starts to occur, and so that's more than likely why we saw that jump in ratios in October. For whitetail sex ratios, it was different for both daylight and spotlight counts. The daylight mean was 0.21, the spotlight count was 0.27. And October was higher in both instances. So again, comparing spotlight within September and spotlight within October, daylight and spotlight within September, October, spotlight was always higher. So we theorized that in September there was some thermal relief going on. Bucks are just going to be more active in the evening. It's a little bit cooler. They're more likely to be running around. In October, we think it was not only that thermal issue, but also the bucks were starting to chase does and starting to come into the breeding season, so therefore they were more active. So deer and sex ratios kind of continued for mule deer. There was no difference for age ratios or sex ratios between months. Now for mule deer, spotlight counts were not conducted. The reason is most of the mule deer habitat is West River. Landowners over West River, we didn't think would be tolerant of spotlights running throughout the countryside, so therefore we didn't do spotlight surveys over there just for whitetail East River. And pronghorn age and sex ratios. I'm going to plop a lot of stuff up here real quick. So high density different in both years, medium density different in 2012 but not in 13, and low density was similar in 12 but different in 13. In all instances, when we detected a difference, August displayed a higher mean in every case. So what may be going on there is someone in question whether harvest and predation was leading to this drop in our age ratios. Now, if you look at any of those age ratios, we can just use high density in 2012 for an example. 2013 also mirrors this. It's a 0.87 versus a 0.66. So, I mean, that's a pretty good drop there, a really good drop. So if harvest and predation were coming into play, our pronghorn population would more than likely be non-existent, especially if that were to take place year after year and if we had a hard winter. So more than likely, it's not going to be attributed to harvest and predation. In addition to that, there's two different studies going on. One is an in-house game and fish study. The other one is a graduate study through SDSU. Both have callers out there, and they're not seeing those predation rates either. So I was fairly confident in saying that more than likely what's occurring here is just a misclassification of fawns as does as time progresses. So more than likely, again, it's just a misclassification. People are seeing those fawns, saying, oh, there's a doe. They're not taking their time to look. Or if they are, they're just being fooled by the body size. I mean, it does take kind of a keen eye to recognize these animals as being whatever age class they're in. As far as bucks are concerned, high density differed in 2012, but not in 13. Kind of the inverse there, a 0.34 in August and a 0.43 in September. Medium density and low density was similar between both years. So more than likely what we're seeing there is an effect of, again, breeding behavior. Those bucks are starting to join up with their family groups. They're just more visible on the landscape. Before, they were individual or in small buck groups, we just weren't seeing them. Now they're in groups of 10, 15, 20, and so they're just a little bit easier to see. Some of the recommendations from all this. For the Black Hills Deer Spotlight Survey, we're going to run an annual survey, so every year we'll use a multiple year moving average to provide a population index, so it's going to go into a population model with several other factors. Now the multiple year moving average, we decided upon that in an effort to, if we had any issues like in 2013, that might be one way to kind of, I don't know if overcome is the right word, but to help us with issues like that. We wanted to increase our transects from the minimum of 42 to what we feel to be the maximum of 62, which lowers the confidence interval and helps those detection rates. For fall classification of deer, we're going to classify both species in October for either daylight or spotlight counts. And we need 60 to 70 adult doe groups. So as before, I said it was something like 30 fawns per unit. Well, that's going to be almost doubled, if not a little over doubled, to 60 to 70 adult doe groups. The reason for that, again, is they're in family groups, just easier to count. The fawns are more active, the bucks are chasing does. Therefore, it's just a little bit easier to do that way. For the recommendations for pronghorn, we're going to classify them in August. We can maximize age ratios that way, reduce misclassification, and as seen, we can still get an adequate sex ratio if need be during August. And again, 60 to 70 adult doe groups would be needed to hopefully properly classify those age ratios rather. And again, they're in family groups and in August, and that misclassification was a big part of it. And we don't want to be misclassifying those animals out there. So the acknowledgements. The study was funded by Federal Aid to Wildlife Restoration, administered through South Dakota Game Fish and Parks. My advisor, Dr. Jonathan Jenks. I got to thank all the Game Fish and Parks staff, basically statewide. I had a lot of help on this. There were three main people that really helped me: Kevin Robley, John Canta, and Andy Lindblom. And I've rattled off quite a few things here today, so this is some of the literature cited. If you'd like a copy of that, just let me know. And I'll wrap it up here with questions or comments. You guys online have any questions or comments?
So sometimes they type them in.
Okay.
We usually do questions first.
I saw 1, 2. Okay.
Okay, how often or how much, based on the population estimates, do they change the permitting for hunting? Like, does it fluctuate, or is it kind of a flat, every year this is how many permits are allowed?
So the way they've actually transitioned the way they're allocating tags these days. So I believe it's every other or every third year a recommendation is made. So they make a recommendation, those 2 or 3 years ride with those tag allocations unless something major happens, a major winter storm, a EHV die-off or something like that, then they come back to it every couple of years. Should there be something major that goes on, then they'll go ahead and have an emergency meeting, for lack of better words, and reallocate those tags. So did I answer your question there?
I was curious if you've done surveys in 2015 and 2016 to look at your population sizes, because it didn't seem like you were getting a tremendous amount of increased, you didn't decrease those confidence intervals that much more for all that effort.
For spotlight surveys?
Yeah.
So spotlight surveys, 2015, we didn't run a spotlight survey. 2016, we did. And I'm still working on that data. I've found a few weird anomalies that I didn't run into with the study. And so I'm trying to figure out exactly what it is. I think it's coming down to basically when we're out there, you're doing it under spotlight. So the way you classify that deer, whether it's tree or meadow habitat, we did it in the study. We actually ran through ARC. We put a buffer around each deer, and then of course around each transect, so that way we can label the deer whether it's a meadow deer or a tree deer. And in 2016, I was hoping that by just having people say it's meadow or trees, that I could kind of alleviate all that work. Well, that didn't work. So I'm having to go back through. I've got a gal that's really great with GIS. She's working on it hopefully as we speak, so I can go through and reclassify those deer and hopefully fix my issue. But what I'm seeing now is these wild detection rates, especially in my treed habitat, and it's giving me an estimate that's far from believable. So I'm hopefully going to get that fixed by Monday.
I was just wondering if, what your inclusion did you have even inclusion probabilities for all your grit samples? Because it looked like the points were a little thinner in the south than they were in the north.
I don't know. That was run quite a few years ago, and I can't remember exactly how that process worked. And someone had helped me do a lot of that, and they're just not available for questioning any longer. And so I'm not sure exactly how that was done. Those particular grid samples were still used, or those points are still being used. So more likely it was probably due to availability of roads is why you're seeing that. So
when you ran your distance sampling, did you just assume those were simple random samples and do regular distance sampling, or did you have to do anything special to accommodate the error structure of a grit's design?
No, I didn't do anything special for it at all. So.
Cheyenne River an effective barrier for pronghorn?
Pronghorn do swim. I've seen them swim.
Okay.
Are we going to see major herds cross it? Probably not. But can they swim? Yes. Seen them do so. So we were hoping it was suitable. We didn't think we had a lot of influx in outgoing pronghorn. So it is an effective barrier. I hope.
So I was curious about the two observers and the fact that I understand it's not easy to understand it, it's a fawn doe. And I was curious about when you collected the data, did everybody do an independent assessment? So you could look for human error, because obviously human error is gonna contribute to some of this.
Right, so what I did is I did look at that on a small scale. I looked at a few of the observers because I was seeing these things and I was like, well, maybe observer error comes into play here. So I picked out a few observers, ones that were consistent. So I had them over both years, I had them all around the state, and they were consistent throughout time. So I was pretty happy with that. Now there was a couple, seasonals and things like that, which we always tried to send with somebody that was informed or had run the survey before. Now I didn't really run any analysis on them just because it's hard to say, and since I don't have anything over time. So, but I did look at a few of the observers to see if there was any perceived observer errors. So. Sure.
So what's the sex ratio in the populations? You talked about the differences, but I was curious when you look at your data overall, because that's going to be really important with regards to demography and the population growth.
For let me come back here. So for deer, the sex ratio, so the sex ratio, so the mean is my sex ratio. So October was the higher mean, 0.85 for spotlights. I apologize, I don't have.
But what are the actual
are
sex
males
ratios?
bigger than
50-50,
Oh,
60-40? I'm actually talking about
I'm sorry.
the number of animals, the sex ratio.
Sure. So when they're born, it's 50-50, but in a hunted population, well, it should be 50-50. So when in the hunted population, traditionally the bucks are going to be lower than does. So what it exactly is, how it pans out, I'm not really quite sure. I guess so over time, but so everything's calculated on the doe essentially, and I think for the most part, we see around a 0.63, I believe it is for whitetail doe to fawn ratio, something like a 0.56 for mule deer, and then again that's for an age ratio. The sex ratios are in the 0.3 to 0.4 range, so for both deer species. And again, you're not seeing that 50-50 bucks per does just because of the hunted population. They may not be born in that 50-50 range either. Although, there is some fetal count studies and some collars and some other studies going on, and I can't recall exactly what they're seeing from those fetal counts and from that. They're looking at the does with a machine. I can't remember the word for some reason. So did I answer your question or kind of?
Kind of.
Okay.
That's okay. Yeah.
We did have a question from West River. So Kurt was asking, do you think drought conditions would be influencing survival rates for the Black Hills? 2012 was first year of a drought, while 2013 was the second.
It is possible. It is possible that they were affecting some of those survival rates. However, we just weren't getting the reports. We weren't seeing the dead deer. We were seeing effects. Especially in Rapid City, a lot of those deer moved from the hills to an area that has water in it. So Rapid and some of the towns, but we just weren't seeing a die-off, which would allude to our population dropping by, 49 versus 37,000. So 12,000 deer. And then the next year it popped back up, so we don't think that was attributing to our fluctuation there. We think it was a detection rate problem. Yeah.
Along those lines, the EHD breakouts that have been happening the last few years, are your survey methods picking up on those, or is it, they seem to kind of come as a surprise?
Yeah, so the surveys were conducted 12, and 13 for everything that was, statewide essentially. So this year, the EHD kind of went from Yankton and kind of a swath up to Pier. We saw a little bit there in the Black Hills, some in Bellevue, some in Sturgis, but we didn't see a whole heck of a lot. So the survey this particular year for Spotlight, I don't know if we picked up on it or not. I haven't even come with the population estimate yet. But we didn't get a lot of reports of EHD over there for the Spotlight survey, and then EHD wasn't present, or at least it wasn't present like it is now during 2012 and 2013. So, yeah.
I'm just curious why the Black Hills has the most roads of all the national parks. Do you know the history of that?
I think it's due to mining. There was a lot of mining back when for gold and various other elements. So a lot of those roads, the Forest Service is now shutting down, which comes back to her question. We'll probably have to run a new tessellation on it. Eventually, so far all the roads that we have haven't been shut down, but yeah, it's more likely due to mining. Any other questions? Any other thing online there? Sure.
What's a hunting unit?
Hunting
So, I
unit.
mean, I was just curious about that, because that's your sampling array.
Sure. So the hunting units are just predetermined areas by Game and Fish, so that's the way they allocate tags. Sometimes it's county-based, sometimes it's road-based. It just depends upon, it's kind of a traditional thing that Game and Fish has done. So a lot of the hunting units, for example, if I can bring up, let's bring up pronghorn just for an example. So pronghorn, those are all different hunting units. So if you kind of look at my mouse cursor, this one right here, that little area is a hunting unit, and this area is a hunting unit there. How those were derived initially, I'm not sure, but those are just areas that Game and Fish allocates tags. So.
All right, let's give Kris one more round of applause. And remember, next week's seminar will move to Animal Science 126 for one day and one day only. There are surveys available for the graduate students in the course. Please fill one out and bring them to the main office.